Welcome to another episode on Wettie TV. In this episode we're on a really quick mission to try and get some fish and some crayfish. Often people ask, where do you find crayfish when you're diving? So here's some tips and some ideas that I try and implement when I'm looking for them. We've hopped in a spot here, it's really shallow and you'll see there's lots of big white boulders. Although at first glance it doesn't look like great crayfish country, this sometimes can be the easiest places to find crayfish. I'm going to cover this white rocky ground, and as soon as I start seeing some big boulders with maybe a little bit of kelp or some life growing on the rocks, this tends to be a good starting spot to look for a crayfish. You'll see here some big boulders here. It's got a little bit of kelp and we're starting to get some good looking coverage underneath the rocks. From the surface you can see some shaded areas that might end up being cracks and holes where crayfish can go into. So I'm going to drop my drop weight with my spear gun attached to it and inspect. Straight away I look under the hole here and there's a nice crayfish to the left hand side. But rather than going for it straight away, I'm just going to inspect all around these boulders here quickly to see if there's other crayfish there or if there's a better way to go for that crayfish and get close to it. Looking around, there are a few other crayfish in there. They're quite difficult to get close to and it's going to be a little bit of a struggle to reach them. I've made my plan of attack and I'm going to go straight into that hole that I first saw that crayfish in. I think I'm skinny enough here to fit in. And I'm going to try and grab it from the right hand side. Now I don't want to grab its feelers, I want to grab something solid. And figuring if I grab it from the right hand side, I can try and jam it against the rock if I don't get a great grab from the get-go. And I'm working my hand to get a nice solid grab and jiggle it free. And success. I think those other crays are going to be a little bit more difficult to get, so I head off. And again, in this sort of bland country with just white rock, I find some big boulders that have got some kelp on it, that have got a little bit more uplift, so they're creating caverns and cracks, which could be good places for the crayfish to congregate. This is able to narrow my attention to a small area. On inspection, this spot's even better. There's a group of nice crays here, especially with one nice big one at the front, which is actually the closest one to get. This time I don't muck around as they have a good escape route and quickly grab the closest one. And you'll notice you're grabbing the spiky horns. You're not trying to grab the feelers, as you'll see how easy they break off. When grabbing a crayfish, you can't hesitate. Don't wave your hand out in front of them, as they're going to make their retreat as soon as possible. Try and get this one in here without it damaging my hands too much into my mini Wettie float boat. I'm going to have another quick look underneath this rock here, just in case a couple of those other ones are still within arm's reach. Here's a great example of adapting when catching a crayfish. You don't always have to grab them by the horns. I get lucky enough this one decides a good spot is to shoot up through the top of the rock. So I'm keeping my hand there blocking its front, even though I can't quite reach it, and I'm going to grab its tail with my other hand and work it out. This is obviously a very lucky scenario, but always be ready to adapt when catching a crayfish, as you don't know what they're going to do. Whether you grab them from above or below is purely up to the situation. And of course, with Auckland regulations in the area we are for crayfish now, the limit is only 3 crayfish. And it only took me about 10 minutes, which is just fantastic. More than enough crayfish for what I need, and I'm able to move on to a different species. Of course, when looking for crayfish, you're going over fantastic ground for snapper as well. So with my 3 crayfish bag limit already sorted, I'm looking for a snapper. Coming over a nice rock here, a snapper's making its retreat over the kelp. Sort of a panicked long shot and I miss. But of course, even though I missed, it was a good sign that there was snapper around, especially considering it's midday, which is not a great time to be targeting snapper. This is a great kelpy gutway that I dive sometimes. Often you get snapper parked up in here. You can't see them in the distance. There's a mob of just nice panties making a retreat. It wasn't a great snoop, this one, as those blue mammals spooked as they came over, which obviously alarmed the snapper and they started moving off. But with a decent visibility, I noticed something that I haven't noticed before when diving the spot. I saw that there was actually a rock out off it, a slight rise in the bottom. And since the rise is not so high, I'm trying to make my approach from a long way out. If I get too close to it, if there is a fish on the other side, I'd spook it before getting close. I'm able to sneak along the bottom here, so I get up nice and close to this rock, so if there is a fish there, I'm well within range. When approaching a big rock, if you do get defining features like this gutway, it's a good place to sneak over, and through there's a big snapper. With limited time, I didn't want to muck around trying to get some nice footage of it, and I made a quick shot. But a really good one. Shooting just behind the head like this, it's a good bony area. When the spear goes all the way through, it's very unlikely it'll get off. Always make sure you keep decent amount of pressure on your spear, as that's what's going to keep your flopper open. So even though it's a good shot, I've still got to play it carefully to get this fish close to me. I want to get my hands in its gills, and once I've done that, often you're able to easily dispatch it and secure the fish. I'll icky the fish and then bleed it straight away to improve the eating quality. And of course that was a fantastic result as well, as I didn't need any more snapper. That one big snapper will provide a lot of meat for the week. Time to get back on the boat and move to one more spot before we head home. The perfect start really. I've got my crayfish, I've got a snapper which is going to be more than enough meat for cooking for the week. The only thing left to target is some species for some raw fish. So we hop into our next spot and we're going to head out to a sort of a weed edge where hopefully we might find either a small kingfish, some trevally or kohiru. John, who's with me, is just checking over the edges just in case there's a snapper around, as he wanted to get a snapper also. Notice how he's taking a really cautious approach here. As it's dirty water and there's lots of bait fish, there could be something good. When he makes his retreat, he tries to pull himself back over the rock without making too much commotion. because sometimes you can miss a fish that was there. This is how we often work in tandem with our dive buddies. Take turns checking over rocks, checking different locations. As if you don't get something, your mate might on his next dive. It's my turn to sneak over now. In dirty water, if you move too violently and too frantically, you can really spook fish that could be close by. What a great looking spot. And here's some big kohuru, which is a great surprise in winter time, and they're a target species for me today. And we're not mucking around, so I'm going to shoot one while I can. Now it's time to dive to the bottom and inspect. And on the way I noticed there's a school of trevally. And rather than chase them in this dirty water, they do seem like they're reasonably calm. So I'm going to try to get to the bottom to make for a better shot. Both trevally and kohuru make fantastic raw fish and will complement the rest of my catch really well. Remember, always bleed your catch before you put them into your float boat. Back down on the bottom amongst all the fantastic bait fish. That school of kohuru are back swirling around amongst the boulders. Although they're often used for bait or for burley, kohuru make fantastic eating, especially as raw fish. Very, very difficult to beat them if you're eating them in the first 2 days of capture. Really, really nice soft flesh and very similar to eating tuna. Back onto the bottom, that trevally school has moved back in. That kingfish catches my eye, but it's not quite big enough, so I'm going to have to leave it for another day. Trevally are quite a versatile fish as well. Obviously you can cook them, you can smoke them, you can have them as raw fish, and they're great all three ways. One last quick dive, and I noticed this underhang here, so I thought I'd do a little bit of bottom time, hide under this underhang, and see if we can pick up another trevally or if something else might come by. Although dirty, this was great scenic diving. A school of snappers start moving in from off the sand and from out of the reef to come inspect me. But we have plenty of snapper from earlier on. Right at the end of my dive, a trevally pops in. So one more of those and then we're done. A dive far more successful than we expected. Picking up those crayfish and that nice big snapper earlier on, and then picking up some nice species for raw fish at the end of the dive.
Nothing wrong with those chews, John.
That one was alright.
A really good quick fire mission.